So now we're joined by Bill and April. Thank you guys for joining us today. Before we dive into conversion therapy per se, I'd like each of you to just tell us a little background on yourselves and also the organizations that you work with. So Bill, if you could start.
Thank you. Is my mic, am I on? Okay. The green light is on.
Okay.
It's on now.
There you go.
Anybody here a member of this church? Well, I was going to say thank you for having us. This is good. This has always been the most welcoming congregation down through the years on social issues and different things, so it's good to be here. My name is Bill Harrison. I am the Executive Director of Diversity Richmond, which is like the LGBT Community Center for Central Virginia. And we raise money through Diversity Thrift. Anybody been to Diversity Thrift? Hello? Where are y'all from Richmond? Okay, I know some of you aren't. We raise money through the thrift store and other special events to put back into the community. In the next few weeks, we will have crossed the $1 million line for money that we've donated. We've helped organizations such as the Fan-Free Clinic to help people have quality health care who have no insurance, Planned Parenthood, the Alzheimer's Association, probably over 100 different organizations since 1999. We partner with a lot of LGBT groups and LGBT-friendly groups in the area, and we do things like this all the time, and it's good to be here, and thanks for coming.
My name is April Prentice. I have been an advocate for conversion therapy, against conversion therapy, for 4 or 5 years now. I did go through conversion therapy when I was in college, and then I actually taught in an ex-gay program through Exodus International a couple years after that. But I live in Richmond now with my wife, Adrienne, and I teach at one of the local colleges.
So jumping back to conversion therapy now, can you sort of go back 30 years ago or so and tell us, what it used to be, what it's morphed into, what labels have been applied, and why?
Well, this conversation, I've been thinking about it for the past couple of weeks, has really made me recall a lot of things that happened. I've been involved since the 1970s. And if it hasn't happened to me, it's happened to somebody that I know. And one memory that comes back is probably about 25 years ago, I was a member of the Human Sexuality Commission for the Episcopal Diocese. I'm Episcopalian. And the church had just stopped a couple of years prior wrestling with whether or not women should be priests. And so, although there are still some communities of faith that don't allow women to be in the pulpit, but that's another workshop. But they had just finished with that, and so they formed the bishop appointed people from around the diocese to be on this commission so we could go out in the community and visit churches and hear what they had to say. And I was invited to speak at a very conservative Episcopal parish up in Northern Virginia. And they called and said that one of their members had successfully been through conversion therapy, and they wanted him to be able to share his story. And I welcomed that because I knew several things. At least this is what I think. I know that you cannot change your sexual orientation, but I have compassion for people who struggle with that because I've been there, and I welcomed his voice. I wanted to hear what he had to say. And so I went, and he spoke and I spoke. We went back and forth. It was very civil, but I had the utmost compassion for him because he was married to a woman, and I knew what was going on. He was trying to make it work. But I couldn't sit there and allow him to preach things that I completely disagreed with. That's why one of the reasons I was there. And so I kept challenging him, gently, but challenging him and asking questions. And so about a month later, I was invited to go to another church in Northern Virginia, and I suggested to them that they call the other parish to see if they could get someone to come and talk. And they called me back and said he had decided not to do that anymore. I've often wondered what happened to him. So it's one thing if an adult wants to enter therapy of any kind, but when we take children, that's where my emotions just get all so torn up. Because I started dealing with this realistically when I was in my early 20s. And when I was growing up, we didn't have things like, we've got groups now that work with youth and hotlines and all these wonderful resources out here. We had nothing like that. I don't know how my parents did it, but I was very blessed because never for one moment throughout my entire life did I ever know that my parents did not love me and they stood right by my side. These are two people with high school educations from a small Southside Virginia farming community, but they were good parents. I was very blessed, and I know a lot of kids aren't. Not that the parents, and I know we're going to talk about this, I just feel so much for parents who might not have that much experience or knowledge of these human sexuality issues. To have a child come home at the age of 12 or 13 and say, I'm gay or lesbian, that's a lot to deal with. And the whole family has to deal with it. It's not just that kid dealing with it. Everybody deals with it. And then when you have a child to come home, I've met so many parents the last few years of transgender children, and they will say their child is 6 years old, my child was born with the anatomy of a boy, but this is a little girl. So to be faced with that as a parent, I cannot imagine. But what I think we need to do is to educate as much as we can, to let families know that they are not alone, and to work together for the best thing for that child.
April, did you want to add anything on kind of history of conversion therapy?
My history?
Or just history about what is conversion therapy now?
Okay.
What techniques did they used to use that are now out of vogue?
I think conversion therapy came to prominence in the 70s. That was with the advent of the ex-gay programs such as Exodus International, which is worked with the Exodus came to be because churches were saying, we have people coming to us who are gay, we don't know what to do with them. We don't know how to help them, we don't know how to make them feel comfortable, we don't know how to make them straight. So Exodus International arose from that. And then conversion therapy as a name, or reparative therapy as a name, started to come about around that time too. So it kind of runs the gamut from the older horror stories that you would hear would be electroshock therapy. You'd hear aversion therapy, where you would have someone look at images, if it was of an attractive man, and they would pour hot water on them or do something to have a negative association with the images of the same sex. You would have what's called rebirthing, where they would put somebody in a burlap sack and have them be rebirthed as a straight individual. I could go on and on with examples like that. Some of them are very, very horrific, and they're well documented as well. What we've kind of morphed into now as the country and our culture has become more accepting of the LGBT community, and the medical professionals have started to push back. The AMA, the APA, all of these organizations have denounced it. It's pseudoscience, right? It's become much more insidious, and so people tend to think, well, now it's just talk therapy. That can't be so bad. But the truth is, it's even more insidious now that it's just become talk therapy. Chris Doyle in the documentary, talked about changing the name from reparative therapy to sexual identity affirming therapy. But if you watch the documentary, you could see clearly that he wasn't affirming anyone's identity except for the identity that he thinks that Nathan should have, the sexual identity that he thinks that he should have. And so you saw it was well documented. I'll tell more of my story later on, but the conflict that you saw Nathan going through, the emotions that he was feeling, all that's very real, and it's very common with people who have survived reparative therapy.
Okay. I just want to jump back to something you mentioned when you were talking about the person had success or thought they were going to have success. And because I noticed this in the documentary too, so does this success have anything to do with the benefit of the person? Is it strictly geared toward religion wants them in a box and it's successful if they can get them into that box?
Well, I'm not a therapist. I can only speak through my personal experience. I think that people try so hard if they find themselves in a situation where they despise who they are. They try so hard to change. And I have always thought with people who say they were successful in conversion therapy, they were never homosexual to begin with. I mean, sexuality can be very complicated. So if you, and I can only go by what you say, If you are happy and you're living a good, healthy life as a heterosexual person, then that's great. But it doesn't mean that being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender is bad. So I question, were they really homosexual if they are found themselves in this healthy, good, loving, peaceful life that they now have? So again, I can only go by what I've lived and by what I've observed in other people.
Yeah.
Oh, I think the crux of to be deemed successful as someone who is ex-gay or someone who's been through this type of therapy means that you're abstaining from sex with someone of the same sex. You could still be having thoughts, sexual thoughts or something like that. But what happens is the crux of the issue is that we all have different identities. We have a religious identity, a cultural identity, our identity at work, right? That are all integrated well. But what reparative therapy asks you to do is to replace your sexual identity with your religious identity. And so if someone like Nathan or like myself, when I went through it, I wanted so badly to be doing what I thought was right in the eyes of God. My religion was extremely important to me, that I was willing to try to put aside those other very real parts of my identity because I felt like my religious identity and being right with God was the most important one. And so it's a matter of choosing, and then it's also a matter of neglecting and suppressing all of these other parts. So, in my experience going through the ex-gay program and through reparative therapy, I've known many people who have been deemed successes, and they know what they're choosing. They know that they're choosing to live a life with someone of the opposite sex. And have a partnership there. Certainly there's sex, there are kids involved, all of those things, but they know that they're not fulfilling necessarily their true identity, many of them. And many of them, when you check back in 5 years later, 10 years later, are living and embracing their sexuality as a same-sex, with same-sex attraction.
Yeah, one of the things that I found so insidious, and I talked to Richard, the director, about this, was it just seemed like the counselor or therapist in that film, there were all these opportunities where he could see what was clearly in Nathan's interest, and then he clearly went the other way every time. And that's, I would hope that statements from all these medical associations do shift things, and if they forcefully come out and say, this is a pseudoscience, this is harmful, and this is why, that it totally delegitimizes the process.
Those statements have been out for a very long time, though. But what Chris Doyle will tell you, I've talked to him directly, and we've been at many of these events where we're advocating kind of against each other. Chris would tell you that what he's doing is in the best interest of his client because he wants his client to be right with God. He wants his identity to be right with God. And that's how these therapists justify what they do, which is obviously against the ethics of social work or the ethics of the APA, but they justify it because they think they're putting the religious apparatus and belief system above that ethical belief system. And so they're saying, well, I'm doing the right thing. I mean, I know that he may want to be gay, but I'm going to choose to push him this way because that's what's right for him. That's how he will live the best life. In the eyes of God.
Is there any room to insist that that can only happen through the religious apparatus? Like, so if you're a priest or you're self-defining as a religious counselor, then fine, you can do that. But if you're just out in the community as a counselor, that's off limits to go and sort of put your religious stuff on that person as opposed to just being a counselor, trying to help that person find their way, whatever that may be.
Not in this case. I mean, most reparative therapists and conversion therapists are highly religious, and the ones that are not on the books are the ones that are operating out of the churches. So there are all kinds of blurred boundaries and blurred professional lines. That's one of the reasons why it's a pseudoscience.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so when I first mentioned this program to Jean Pupke a couple months ago, she said, I'm not the one you should speak to, talk to April. This is good for us, not so good for you. Can you tell us about your experience of conversion therapy, what it was like, and is it still impacting you? Have you gotten over it? Are you still haunted?
Oh, gotten over it. I don't know that that's ever really possible. It's a deeply disturbing, deeply traumatizing experience to go through it. I subjected myself to conversion therapy. I grew up in a highly religious, fundamentalist Christian home. My parents were great. My parents didn't even know that I was struggling with my sexuality. I was so scared to tell them. When I was in college and I realized what was happening, I subjected myself to the therapy. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. I went to a therapist that was on campus, and I said, I don't want to be gay. I think this is what's happening. I'm pretty sure I'm gay. I definitely am attracted to women, and I can't be this. I can't be this. I don't want to be this. And so I went through about 2 years of counseling there. What I'll tell you is being in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s, when my identity was still trying to form, and so many other, it's the first time I was away from home, I was at college. It is deeply damaging to be told and have that affirmed that who you are is not okay. And if I was going to see a therapist that was ethical, they would help to guide me in figuring out my identity, right? My sexual identity and my identity as a woman. But instead, it was, there's a darkness within you. My therapist believed that I was demon-possessed and actually put me through an exorcism. This is an extreme case, and there are many cases that these extreme things haven't happened, but the talk therapy was actually the most damaging of it, because just like you saw in the movie was actually very difficult for me to watch. It was very triggering, because the way that he was relating to him and the things that Nathan was experiencing are exactly the same things that I experienced, that internal struggle that he felt. He said something in the movie about other people's happiness costs less than mine. That's a totally true sentiment, where I was in my early 20s and I was thinking, okay, well, my options are going to be to, be with women and live out what I think is my true sexual identity and be a sinner and not be able to be okay in the eyes of God, which again was very important to me at that time. Or to choose to live with a man and pursue a relationship that way that's never going to fully fulfill me, or to be abstinent, which that wasn't happening. So, these were my choices. And so at 19 and 20 years old, I was thinking these are the only choices for my life. And all of those thoughts were being affirmed by a conversion therapist. And so what he didn't talk about a lot, but I think you could obviously see in the documentary that he was depressed, that he was struggling a lot. It throws you into a pool of self-hatred that's very hard to describe. You are taught to to hate yourself. You are taught to do whatever you need to do to drive those thoughts out of your body. And this is the same thing with the ex-gay programming that I went to after college. You're taught that you can't just go out to dinner with a friend without being asked, just like Chris Doyle asked him, why are you wanting to go with that person? Are you feeling attractions towards that person? Every single thing that you do, you're taught to analyze it, right? And so it was dangerous to put a 19 or 20-year-old woman through that, because I subjected myself to it, but it was extremely dangerous. And so for me, it drove me to try to escape this total internal conflict that I felt constantly. I couldn't concentrate on my studies. I couldn't concentrate on being with my friends. It was, am I okay? Am I going to be okay? Oh my gosh, I thought that woman looked attractive. Oh no, I'm going into these gay thoughts again. And so for me, it turned into a spiral, as it does with many people who are in conversion or reparative therapy, of drugs, alcohol, trying to just escape anything that I could. And my life was in danger many, many times throughout the process. When I went into the ex-gay programming, it was worse in a way, because I'd already been through reparative therapy. And so then what they choose to do is dig, as you saw with Chris Doyle. They do not believe that you can be born gay. If you have same-sex attractions, by their belief apparatus, something has happened. There's some kind of a wound that has happened, that you're having those attractions. And so what ex-gay programming does, and reparative therapy, is they dig and dig and dig until you find that wound. So they'll call it a mother-father wound or sexual abuse wound or something like that. And so I could sit there and say, have a good relationship with my mother, have a good relationship with my father. I don't know where this is coming from, but you're taught to analyze and analyze until you find something. And in many cases, the therapist will kind of encourage you to invent a cause as well, right? And I had that happen as well, so.
Yeah, as I said, that's something just in critical thinking reading, you learn about kind of a phase where therapists were not just digging, but almost planting these ideas, did this happen, and then, you can maneuver the conversation, and then you'd suddenly have people suing their parents because they think they're victims of incest or all these things that didn't happen, which isn't to say it doesn't happen frequently and there's a huge problem with it, but there are all these planted memories, and the more we learn about how the brain works, you can plant a memory in somebody and then they genuinely believe it. And so it really is a problem when you have a therapist that isn't working on your behalf, but on some other preconceived agenda.
That exact thing happened to me. And I also have several friends in advocacy who, I have one very good friend who is just really traumatized, very extremely still broken with her wounds from reparative therapy, and they implanted in her mind that her father had sexually molested her. And it took her years to figure out that had been implanted as a cause, and her father passed away before she could reconcile with him, and it's something that still to this day breaks her. And these are the real consequences of this. Suicide is a real consequence, and people living their lives in constant turmoil, hating themselves, and not able to. If you could tell from Nathan, he was kind of arrested. He stopped with his growth, right? With his maturation process, everything stops. Everything becomes about that, and it's hard to live your life outside of it.
Now, Bill, it sounds like you were very fortunate in your parents. Taking aside your personal situation, how much do you think fundamentalist religion underlies all this problem that we have with shaming gays, making them hate themselves, versus just other cultural things? Like, if we got rid of fundamentalist religion, would that solve most of the problem? And then as a corollary, what message would you give to young people that are struggling, or even adults that are struggling with their sexual identity?
Well, I think it's interesting that from what I've seen, when people have problems with the LGBT community, it's usually based on their religious beliefs. That was never a conflict for me, because I always knew if there was one being that would understand, it would be God. So that's never a conflict that I ever had. I think that, just we can open up any history book and see the insane cruelties that people have done through the centuries in the name of God. And I like to think that they actually believe they're doing the best, but it's been damaging many, many times. I mean, I remember back when we integrated the schools back home, and I was a Baptist, which I have a great deal of respect for that church, and a minister raised the Bible and said if God wanted us all to be together, he would have made us all look alike. And so that was using religion to justify segregation. So I think religion's been used for a lot of things. I wouldn't suggest that we do away with fundamentalist religion, because it's America and everybody has the right to worship the way they choose. But it does bother me when I see young people, especially children. I mean, these are babies. A baby's 12 years old. I know they think they're grown up, but they're babies. And to be thrown into this intense therapy when they are made to feel guilty and bad about who they are, they had no choice in it. We don't choose it any more than we choose the color of our eyes. It's wrong. And I think if there really is a heaven, when a lot of people get up there, if they make it, they're going to be in for some rude awakenings about what we should have been doing.
And what message would you offer? So if you were a counselor, or a parent, or a friend, or teacher, what's a better message to give people if they come to you struggling? And like, you do face a lot of potential alienation as a gay person, so what do you tell them? I mean, they're going to have real problems being openly gay, but what's a more positive, healthy message that you might give other than hide it?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking at you.
Oh, is it?
All right, well, I'll say something and then
Oh,
you
you guys can share for any question. You guys are always welcome to jump in either way.
I don't feel alienated personally. I know some people do, but I don't. And I don't feel that way. I did at one time. I mean, dealing with who you are when it's socially unacceptable back in the day, it's a lot better today, obviously, than it was. Mm-hmm. You know, when I was 20 years old, the thing of same-sex marriage never crossed my generation's mind. We were more worried about getting fired from our jobs and being disowned by our families than we were getting married. So I think young LGBT people today, I know this is off the subject, don't know the history of our community. And I think that whether you're a racial minority or you're a woman or whatever, you really do need to know the history of your struggle to know that you are able to do the things you're able to do today because a lot of people sacrificed tremendously for that when it wasn't popular to do that. When I was growing up, I mean, there were no lobbyists working for us. We weren't talked about in politics. I remember the first time I voted for Bill Clinton, I actually kind of got emotional in the ballot box because he had reached out to us on his presidential campaign, and I never thought I would ever live to see that happen. Mm-hmm. And I thought this is the first time I've ever voted for a candidate who really cares about me.
I'll note that one of our former speakers was a gay man who wasn't particularly an activist, and in choosing to be a secular activist, he said, I've come to realize all the work that people did a generation before me so that being gay isn't such torture, and that's part of why he now wants to be an activist, to help pay that forward. Mm-hmm. So April, we spoke very briefly ahead of time. Darrell Ray is the head of Recovering from Religion and the Secular Therapist Project. He has a book called The God Virus that talks about how religion creates, fabricates out of thin air a problem. The believers in that now have a problem that they can't really deal with, so they're first forced to go to the church to get that fixed, but it can't really get fixed, so they're now in this vicious, permanent cycle that spirals downward, where they're more and more desperate for, absolution from the church. Watching the documentary, I saw a lot of parallels to that, and can you tell your story? So you were in the ex-gay program not as a counselor, but as somebody who was in the position to guide other people away from their gayness. Can you talk about that and how you became part of that cycle?
Yes, that's not the part of my history that I'm in any way proud of, but I did go through an ex-gay program for 2 years, and then I turned around and taught in an ex-gay program. And that was actually the beginning of the end for me with my struggle with my sexuality. Once I was asked to tell a 17-year-old girl, here are your options, just like I thought those were my options in my 20s, I started to think, this is not it. Like, this is not the right thing. But I was a counselor, it was kind of a counselor, not a licensed counselor, but through the church, through an Exodus program, we did a lot of the same things that Chris Doyle was doing with Nathan. We would write stuff on pieces of paper about attractions to women, or about any parts of our wound that we thought that we had if our father called us too masculine or our mother called us too feminine. We would write it on it and we would burn it. We would write stuff like that on mirrors and we would break them. We would do all these kind of physical ways to kind of purge. We would fast, obviously, that was kind of taken for granted. And we were encouraged to, and I encouraged people when I was teaching in it to, if you're a woman, to do things that were effeminate, and if you're a man, to participate in masculine activities. And, if you want to know more about that kind of programming, you could look at Exodus International, although that organization has closed now, thank God. And the leader, Alan Chambers, definitely denounced what he had been doing and realized the damage that he had been doing for generations of gay people in the church. So it's great that that's shut down. But when I was a teacher in the ex-gay program and was leading a small group and putting these women through the same things that I had been put through, I started to get more of a cognitive dissonance in my head of, this girl's 17 years old. Am I getting ready to send her down this path that I have just walked, that I barely survived, and was still barely surviving, even though I was teaching it? That was the beginning of the end for me. I cannot continue to perpetuate this. If it's not true for her, it's not true for me. She can live a full life as a gay woman. If that's, you asked about the message. What message should we send? Exodus was famous for sending a message of there is no happiness in the gay life. The gay life is drugs. The gay life is having sex in back alleys. The gay life is misery and darkness. And there was never a positive image of a healthy, happy gay couple or a healthy, happy gay life put in front of you. So it was easier to control you if you thought my only option is this really, really horrible thing or being right with God. Right? It made it much easier to be controlled. So I definitely taught in the ex-gay program, and only did that for one cycle. It was about a 9-month cycle, and about 6 months after I ended that cycle is when I started to come to terms with my sexuality and realized just that the struggle wasn't born of the God that I knew. Or wasn't born of the love that I knew, that the struggle was manufactured.
And one thing that jumped out at me in the documentary was this idea that, take all these memories, dredge them up,
Right.
burn them, shatter them, do everything violent and visceral that you can, that's going to help you forget. And that's going to etch it, that creates that emotional valence, so now it's going to be with you forever. So you're going to need to keep going back for more and more therapy because that really just burns it into your your being. The other thing you mentioned about 12-year-old is still a baby. We had a neuroscience talk, and your brain really is still developing and rewiring itself into your 20s. And so catching people in their teens really does seem damaging and unfair and predatory. That you're not getting, maybe they're technically an adult so they consent, but they're not really fully formed people that are ready to make some decisions.
Yes, the advocacy group I work with, which is Alliance for Progressive Virginia, has been working for years to we've introduced legislation 3 separate times into the GA here in Virginia to protect minors. If people who are adults, like you said earlier, want to subject themselves to this, like I did, it's still damaging, it's still unethical, but they're adults and they have a choice. But to put this on a child who is still trying to figure out who they are in this world and say a huge part of who you are is not okay. We don't support a huge part of who you are, and there's a cure, which conversely means that it's a sickness, right? That is the most vulnerable thing that you can, those kids are the most vulnerable that they'll ever be, and so it's hugely damaging. The younger this process starts with them, the more damage that they have. I've seen that through my friends that have walked through advocacy with me. The younger they start, the more damage they continue to be. So you asked, can you get over it? Can you recover from it? I think you can become a fully integrated human being, and I think that you can live out your life. But I think to the degree through which you've gone through it, and at the age that you started with it, you will always carry a pretty huge wound from it, a deep trauma.
Now, Bill, this is for you. So Richard Yeagley is a straight guy, but he considers himself a friend to the LGBT community. I think a lot of us in the humanist community consider this just a barbaric process, and we'd like to be involved. You noted that one of the things you love about Diversity Richmond is you don't have to be LGBT to be connected with it. So can you talk about the importance of building bridges outside of your own, and for all of us, outside of our own narrow activist communities? How do we reach out to others in an effective way to share problems? And then on the outside, how do we become helpful advocates without trying to take over the story? How can we help? Yeah.
Well, I think working in nonprofit, you very quickly learn it's a lot easier to partner with another organization than it is to try to go out and do it by yourself. And so one of the things I think that smart activists have done for a long time is that we identify with the struggles of other communities, and we can partner on issues that are not LGBT related. Any number of things come to mind. I also think, to give you a quick example, at Diversity Richmond, we, through Diversity Thrift, we have enough clothing to clothe everybody in the city of Richmond. And so I started looking at the clothing needs in the city, and so now we have relationships with several of the public school systems where if their families are on public assistance, they can come shopping for clothing for free at Diversity. And a letter that I got 3 years ago that I just treasure, I know it by heart. I got a letter from a mother whose 3rd grade daughter had been crying for weeks about going to school and getting on the school bus, and she wouldn't talk to her parents about what was wrong. And so one of the teachers from school contacted the parents and said, your daughter's being ridiculed and bullied every day because she wears the same clothes all the time. Her shoes are worn out, and she's being made fun of. And so she got in touch with us, and they came and they went shopping, and I got this letter. He said, Mr. Harrison, I don't know if you have children or not, but nothing pains you more than when you see your child hurt. And my daughter is now happy to get on the school bus. Well, let me tell you, I mean, I don't have any kids, but I look at it, and I'll admit it, I had an ulterior motive here. I grabbed an opportunity for people out there to get to know my community on a different level. We weren't talking about civil rights, we weren't talking about marriage, we were talking about something that we all had in common, seeing that children have clothes to wear to school. And so in that letter that the mother wrote, she said that she was brought up to not have anything to do with gay people because of the religious aspect, and she was writing her mother, telling her that God was very much alive at Diversity Richmond. So that's an example. It's strategic planning, but it's also the right thing to do. It's what we do as good people. to take care of one another. And I think along those lines is that we get to know each other. And that's been the problem with whether it's race or gender or immigration or whatever. We don't know each other. We've never sat down and had a conversation. We've never listened. And so when you get to know us, you see that we have a lot in common. Let me just share this real quickly and I'll stop. About 4 years ago, Richmond City Council is very supportive of us, of our community. The mayor is very much a champion of ours. And several years ago, for the first time, Richmond City Council declared Pride Month in June. And when we accepted the proclamation at City Council that night, I said, let me share with you real quickly what we want. We want our police and firefighters to be paid a decent wage. We want our schools to be quality schools that we can send our children. We want our streets not to have potholes. We want to see poverty and crime addressed. And we also want to be treated like first-class citizens. We don't want to be fear that we will be fired from our jobs because of who we are. That's what we want.
Yeah, but do you have anything to add on sort of just reaching outside of your narrow activist interest to connect with other groups?
Oh, I think Bill pretty much said it all. I mean, you will get further by collaborating with other groups who are willing to stand up. And I think, it also, we talk about this all the time in our society now, people with, for instance, white privilege helping people of color. It's the same thing with straight privilege, right? But it's also, we can reach out and we can offer a level of understanding and a level of advocacy for other people who are not being treated fairly under the law or in our culture's eyes by reaching out and collaborating with them. That's the way activism is done, good activism. Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to have a couple more questions. If anybody in the audience wants to ask things, Rachel has a microphone in the back, so just kind of hold up your hand, get her attention. So April, regarding conversion therapy, the legislative focus has been on minors because they don't have, it shouldn't necessarily be, it's not up to them, it's up to their parents. Can you run through what are the potential harms of conversion therapy, like what's happening to these kids or to adults after they go through it? Do you consider conversion therapy another form of child abuse? Is it at that level? Is it that damaging? And then after that, what is the Born Perfect campaign, which ties into that?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a complicated question. I think the first thing that I would say, and it's hard to say it because they do cause so much damage, and I'm not taking their side in any way, but I do believe that these therapists believe that they're doing the right thing for the child. It's hard to stomach that, and it's hard to say that in any kind of an objective way, but that's what they think that they're doing. So would I say it's child abuse? I say it's abusive, it's unethical. It's certainly not doing anything that's going to help the child. What you're talking about is, as I've already said, telling a child a huge part of who you are is not okay. A huge part of who you are is not accepted by your religion. And if a child has grown up in a religious house, and most of the kids that go through reparative therapy have grown up in highly religious houses, I definitely did, your religion is important to you. Being right with God or obeying God is important to you. And so you're being told that something that you cannot change is offensive to your God, is offensive to your parents, is offensive to your culture. And so if you just think about, which children, for instance, who are bullied, all of the effects that a child can get from bullying, this is a form of bullying, right? And so you're talking about the risk of suicide. I don't have the statistics. I don't know if you can rattle them off, but the rate of suicide in the LGBT community for teenagers is already astronomical, because even without reparative therapy. But when you add reparative therapy to that, you have a medical professional who's hanging a sign outside the door saying, "I am credentialed." Right? I am a professional that can help you, and I am telling you that there's something deeply wrong with you. If you can imagine the impact of that on a child. So Born Perfect is a campaign started through the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and I've partnered with them, so is Alliance for Progressive Virginia. And they started a nationwide campaign to pass legislation in all of the states to ban conversion therapy for minors. We have to protect the children. Adults are going to do what they're going to do. If they choose to subject themselves to that, then so be it. Although I think it should be outlawed completely. But the children are vulnerable, and so should a parent be able to choose to subject their child to this? You bring up all of these. I'm not a parent, so I can't speak from that point of view. But you bring up all of these issues of, well, I know what's best for my child. You can't tell me how to raise my child. You can't tell me. But there are legal precedents, the anti-vaccination laws, child labor laws. There are already precedents out there that protect parents from subjecting their children to something that can be harmful. So far, through the efforts of Born Perfect, and there are other organizations like 50 Bills in 50 states, 9 states in Washington, D.C. have outlawed conversion therapy for minors. And we continue. Last year, we didn't bring legislation here in Virginia because it's a tough sell, and it was becoming a saturated issue. But there are legislative efforts in almost every state to outlaw this for the minors, especially to protect them and assure that they can't be taken to a medical professional that says, I'm credentialed, I know what I'm talking about, there's something really wrong with you. It doesn't matter if you think you can't change it, you've got to change it. And it's coercive,
So, Bill, you had mentioned it really shakes you when this happens to kids. Do you have any thoughts on how we weigh the parental right to do whatever they think is best versus the kid's protection from harm? Do we side with religion, or do we side with science and the medical community saying there's nothing to be cured, this doesn't work, and it's harmful?
Well, that's a tough one for me because, again, I have never been a parent. I believe that parents should have the ability, the right, to know about everything that's going on in their child's life until they're 18 years old. And if you're putting them through college, I think you've got another 4 years. You have the right to know everything. That's my personal opinion. The abortion issue, for example, parental consent, that's a real... I'm not a parent. I can't answer for anyone. It's real conflicting because I hate it when another right is being taken away from somebody. And you have your child, and this child is your sole responsibility, and I think you should be able to decide what is right for them. So I think the key here is to do what we're doing today. We've got to publicize how dangerous this therapy is. We've got to do that. And hopefully parents will. It's a tough question. I'm torn with the answer to that, but I do know that it's evil and it's so detrimental. Whatever the childhood scar is, and we all have them, without some intense therapy, it's not going to go away, and it can haunt us for the rest of our lives. And this definitely is something that will haunt people for the rest of their lives if they don't get into a healthy place and learn how to deal with what's happened to them.
Could I add to that for a second? Also, just like I said that about the therapist, I believe that the parents think that they're doing the right thing for their children when they go and subject them to this, but I think they don't understand the kind of damage that it can have on their child. I think they're freaked out, they don't know how to handle it, but they don't understand the long-term implications of this. People in their 20s and 30s who have fought it and commit suicide, or people who have any number of emotional wounding from going through it. But I think that education is absolutely the key. There are so many people, when I started doing this advocacy work for this specific issue years ago, people are like, that still happens? People just still do that? I'm like, yes, all the time. It's a thriving business. So I think educating the parents so that they know the possible effects is huge. Yeah, I don't think any parent would. I'm not saying any parent, because some people just want their child to be straight because they believe that it's the right thing to do. There's maybe hyper-religious parents, but I think most parents would not, if they really truly knew the cost of subjecting their child to this, would hesitate, if not stop doing it. If they really understood, if they talked to people who had been through it and heard what their lives were like.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point that you both make, and that we should all internalize, that people generally don't do things thinking they're bad.
Right.
So I agree with you that probably the counselors think they're doing good on one level, the parents certainly are trying to act in their kids' best interest, But you also brought up, the whole anti-vax thing, and the documentary, for everybody who hasn't seen it, starts with Dr. Oz, who's a medical doctor, but one of the biggest purveyors of alternative medicine nonsense that's out there, and he uses MD to create all sorts of data that people that bogus they should rely on bogus therapies. So with the anti-vax movement, we do as a society have a right to say this harms those kids, this harms society. We have to balance different rights, such as the parental right versus society's right and the kid's right. And I guess that can lead to the next question is, so I personally think that there should be, legislative protection for the kids. We're now faced, hopefully it kicks back on, we're now faced with Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Jeff Sessions, Roy Moore, who's been censured previously for his religious maneuverings to keep the Ten Commandments in a court, is now potentially going to be the Alabama senator. So you have such an array of people that are so regressive and have been so profoundly anti-gay. Does that change your legislative approach for the next few years? What do we do now? Do you just look on the state and local levels? Do you give up on federal? What's happened to are your communities energized because they're fighting against this really bad foe, or are they just demoralized because we voted them into office? And so if you can both kind of comment on our current political situation.
Bill?
Well,
and then if there are any audience questions, I'd like to jump to the audience.
I was given some advice years ago by a very dear friend. He said, everything happens exactly the way it's supposed to. And that's got me through some pretty tough stuff. So I think that this is a wake-up call for a lot of people. We took a lot for granted. And it's a wake-up call, and hopefully we will wake up, because I don't think that people you mentioned speak for the vast majority of Americans on a lot of issues of justice. The economy and all that, but on justice, I do not believe that they speak for us. I don't believe they speak for, I just don't believe that. And I think that we need to speak up. Years ago, if you're old enough, you can remember the moral majority. Remember Jerry Falwell's group, the moral majority? Well, he rallied people who were sick and tired of the way things were going, and that is what we need to do. We have got to rally the troops. I live right over here, and the first 2 times I went to vote for Barack Obama, like everybody, I stood in line for 2.5 hours, which I was happy to do. The following November, when I went to vote for governor, I walked right in and I pulled the lever. We get what we deserve sometimes.
I would say changing the legislative approach will have to happen. But I think the focus shifted. There was hope there for a while because, Obama came out and talked about conversion therapy and condemned conversion therapy. That was a really big moment for our community, and for especially those of us who are in advocacy, to have someone at the national stage, the highest power in our land, say, this is wrong, I recognize that this happens. And even that did a lot to promote education of it. And then Hillary Clinton had that as part of her campaign. So there was hope for a while. Mike Pence, in my opinion, is a danger, a direct danger to our community. I think everybody knows that. How do we legislate against that? I think there has been more of a turn at the state and the local level to try to enact change there. I'm not saying that we're giving up at the national level, and I'm certainly not speaking for all of the advocacy groups on conversion therapy, because all of these movements are still happening. I think the approach that we take is we will continue to try to enact legislation, we'll continue to fight, and along the way we'll continue to educate. And our hope would be eventually that if enough people are educated about the realities of it and the dangers of it and the results of it, that it would eventually at some point become easy to pass the bill. So I think it's more of a turn towards the state and the local level at this point. But again, I can't speak for all of the advocacy groups out there.
Do we have anybody in the audience that has questions? Rachel, you can go to Ellen. Maybe start with her.
Hi, I was just wondering if the conversion therapy is covered, the expense of it. Is it covered by healthcare insurance?
That's a good question. My understanding is that most of the people that are practicing conversion therapy and reparative therapy don't name it that. And so, so it's just billed under general, the child would be given maybe like a gender dysmorphic disorder or some kind of, of those, some kind of an. Oh, there's a lot of dishonesty about it. They have to be dishonest to make it work, because all of the major medical organizations have come out and said 100% this is wrong, this is pseudoscience. But they're still advocating. There was a case in front of the Supreme Court a couple years ago that was still trying to fight. Chris Doyle was part of that case. There was also a case a couple years ago of the organization NOAA, and Jonah, I'm sorry, I don't remember what that stands for, but it was a conversion therapy organization in New Jersey where there was kind of a class action lawsuit against them, and they lost the case. So there are legislative victories happening, maybe not on a large scale, but they're happening. But Chris Doyle doesn't bill what he does as conversion therapy, even though it's very much what he does. And so there is dishonesty in order to continue to thrive that way.
Okay, can you wait for the mic so we can pick it up? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Is conversion therapy still common among children, especially in the red states?
I don't know if I can answer that conclusively, but I think that what is happening is that a lot of the therapists are partnering with churches, and they're working through churches that way. Most of the time, I have rarely heard of cases of parents subjecting their children to that if there was not a religious component involved, right? So I think you could probably logically say in the red states, in the Bible Belt, that there would be more of it there. But I don't know. I can't answer that conclusively.
Thank you both for coming today. Will and Grace recently had an episode of this a few weeks ago, and I was wondering if you'd seen it, and if you comment on if they handled it well or what your thoughts were.
Yeah, when you take a social, or you take an issue that is so real and can be so painful, and then we joke about it. But I think humor's a great way to bring some understanding about it. So I really like the way they handled it. It was a young man who was in conversion therapy because they did some pretty stereotypical things to make him, he's gay. So they put him in, and it had a happy ending. But I liked it because they've got a wide audience. On the other hand, they were probably preaching to the choir. I don't know how many people watch Will and Grace who don't like Will and Grace. So, I don't know whether the Bible Belt was watching the other night, but I thought they did a very good job of it. And I think sometimes we become so ultra-sensitive about stuff. Oh, we can't joke about it. Well, I think humor has helped us a lot. Nobody knows gay jokes more than we do, and I can laugh at the best of them. It's a difference if we're sharing it with the right, but if you're yelling faggot at me while you're telling it, that's not funny to me.
Right. Yeah, I thought they handled it really well. I liked what they did. I know someone who was involved in the writing of that episode, and it wasn't even hard to get them to do it. They wanted to jump in. They wanted to educate at that level too. And I think the more, that's how we got marriage equality, is that people started to come out to their family and friends, and it became, we raised awareness in their culture. We're here. I'm right beside you. I'm working beside you. I didn't try to turn you gay. I didn't try to, come after you or anything like that. And so I think it works this way, and we're certainly not the first community to have to do this, right? But the more it gets out there, when Hillary Clinton made her big announcement about conversion therapy, there was some kind of data about how many people went to Google to search it after she made the announcement. And so I think, the more we can get it out there, the better. The more people turn and say, well, what is that? That's still happening. And I think you made a good point earlier that I wanted to say, that when we talk about Trump and Pence and those people that are in power right now not representing most of America, I totally agree with that. And I totally agree that most of America, if they understood what was going on with conversion therapy, would fight against it. I think it would be easy to form those collaborations, but education is the key.
Yeah, I would say, even as a secular activist, I was vaguely aware of conversion therapy somewhere in the background of 100 things I pay attention to. But it wasn't until Richard Yeagley reached out to me and said, "Are you interested in this?" that I made myself a little more aware and started to understand the importance. So I think having something like Will and Grace, where it's going to reach tens of millions of people, that is really important, and getting it into the the social fabric and not just the tiny activist community. Then you can have that wellspring, and suddenly, instead of instead of it being this tiny issue for a tiny group of people, suddenly things change.
Well, and our community is just as diverse as any community. I met many gay people who didn't know that conversion therapy existed or who knew anybody who had gone through it. So even Will and Grace, with that speaking probably to the choir, but, there are still people that were educated by that who are within the gay community that didn't know that that's a reality, especially the new generation. And so I think they did a great thing.
Anybody else? I'm good. Right there.
Since we know the attempts right now with the legislative attempt is not going well, wouldn't it be more effective to do this in the courts and try to find a lawsuit maybe, to protect a person's individual rights?
Yes, I agree.
Has any of that been done yet,
Yeah, there was just a case, I want to say about a year and a half ago, of the organization Jonah, where a bunch of the clients took the organization, the conversion therapy organization, to court and won a case there. And so I think that started to happen. I'm not sure if there are any out there pending against Exodus. I know that there was talk of that when they, that was one of the main mechanisms that started to put pressure on them to shut down, as people were talking about class action suits, about depression and suicide and all of those types of things. So I think the legislative route would be a great way to go. And fighting it.
Judicial?
The judicial, yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Doesn't that, I'm not a lawyer, but doesn't that set a precedent that would give other people rights to, let's say, a young adolescent to reject the conversion therapy that their parents are trying to instill upon them?
I think it's a valid point. You look at marriage. I think Virginia would have eventually gotten there. I probably would have been long dead by the time people in Virginia voted for same-sex marriage, but the courts brought it about, and it was the right thing to do. But I think it's a valid point because so many times issues should not, I don't know if how I can word this. Sometimes I think, like with marriage, for example, civil rights issues should not be settled at the ballot box. And I see this as a civil rights issue. And sometimes I think it's best for the courts to step in. I want the voters to have as much power as possible about what goes on in their own community, but sometimes I think it does bring right along a lot quicker if it's a judicial decision. Virginia was the 48th state to approve personalized license plates. So I don't know how long it would have taken us to do marriage.
This is to April. Since religious teaching seemed to cause a lot of your problems, I'm wondering what your relationship is now with your religion.
That's a great question. I would say it's still very much in flux because there's been a huge part of my life where I've had to extract myself from Westernized Christianity, which is what I grew up in, and trying to, once I realized, I've been taught all of these things about being gay that I know now are wrong, what else is wrong? What else have I been taught that's wrong? So there's been a whole process of having to tear that down and then try to figure out what do I do with my spirituality and with this part of me that has faith, right? And so it's still very much in flux. It's a big part of my life that's missing in a lot of ways, but I'm still seeking to try to define it and to try to figure out, what I believe and all of those things. So it's caused. This is another consequence of conversion therapy. Even if you come out of it in a good way, which thank goodness I was able to come out of it and embrace who I am, there's still a huge loss. And that part of it is also traumatic. So I lost this apparatus, this belief system that I had been reared in, that I served as a missionary. I taught in a Christian school, 16 years of Christian education, so it was a huge part of me that was missing. And I'm thankful for that because that allowed me to think for myself and to embrace who I am. But it's still very much in flux for me. That's a great question, though. I get asked that question a lot.
Do you want to say anything about your relationship with religion at this point?
I'm a good Episcopalian. I go to lunch. I go to church on occasion. Like I said, that was never an issue with me. And I remember when I joined St. Paul's, I went home one weekend for something at Adams Grove Baptist Church, where I love. And Aunt Gertie Harrell, who played the piano, said to me, I hear you joined the Episcopal Church. What do they do for you that we don't? And I said, well, Aunt Gertie, it's not what they do for me, it's what they let me do that you don't. And she was kind of puzzled by that. But I love spirituality, and I love talking about it. And when I was growing up in the Baptist church, every Sunday we read this thing where this is who we are. One of the things was you couldn't consume alcohol or work at a place that sold alcohol. Well, I heard them all reading it, and I looked around the room and I thought, either you need to change the rules or you need to go to church somewhere else because I know too much about what goes on here. That's one rule we're not following. So I thank God has a sense of humor, and I thank God I have one. It gets me through a lot of stuff. And I saw a play at Barksdale years ago. I think it was called The Spelling Bee, and all these kids were just under so much pressure because they were going to this big statewide spelling bee. And this one little girl was down on her hands and knees praying to God that she did well. And Jesus appeared in the background on stage and said, you know, I really don't get caught up in stuff like that. So that's kind of how not being white about the question, I have never had that as being an issue with me. And I certainly sympathize with people who do, because we both know a lot of people that still to this day, people my age, are struggling with their religion and their sexual orientation. And there's a wonderful church here in town, Metropolitan Community Church. It's basically an LGBT congregation. But what we've also seen is the Methodists and Presbyterians and Episcopalians coming around and learning and welcoming people. And it's a struggle with their own churches, but they're hashing it out, and that's the way the good stuff comes about.
Just to throw my 2 cents in here, I'm very much an atheist activist. I think that religion is damaging, even for people that tend to be progressive, that it lets other things slide by that wouldn't. That said, our humanist program is completely supported by the Unitarian Church. We have our things here. We have members here that help run our tech stuff. They're incredibly inviting to the atheist and agnostic community. So I think there's a very big difference between fundamentalist religion and much more progressive variants of it. There's parts of magical thinking, which some people call spirituality, that it may be harmful. In my mind, it's harmful to have magical thinking about anything. We always want to best grasp reality as we can so that we can address reality. But that said, I have much more kinship to humanists that have some spirituality than the Koch brothers who may or may not believe in God but are out there destroying our environment. Do we have right here?
The conversation took a turn. Now I feel like my question is more appropriate. But one of the things I found most provocative in the documentary was when Nathan was saying he had a feeling that he needed to be held. He needed physical intimacy, not necessarily sex, but it was like a need to be held. And he talked about assimilating the body of Christ to the sacrament and how that became basically a way, I took it as a replacement for needing the intimacy with another person, that he actually had this experience with God that replaced that. So in light of what each of you have said, you each have kind of a different take on the religious aspect. Was that a real experience with God? Was that a product of the conversion therapy? Was it something else? What were your impressions?
And Bill, can I ask you to put that headset on, because I don't know if we'll capture your audio without it.
Well, I think we can't judge whether that was a real experience with the God that he believes in or not. That's not for us necessarily to judge. I do know that one of the things that is pounded into you in ex-gay programming is God will be your husband, God will be your wife, God will be your best friend, God will be your mother, God will be your father, so you don't need anybody else but God. And that was used as a point of, you're dissatisfied with your life. It's okay if you're not enjoying your life as long as you're okay with God, because God will satisfy you that way. And I think we saw Nathan, I really related to his struggle there. Well, I'm doing all of these things. I'm jumping through these hoops. I'm doing this therapy. I'm abstaining. I'm, doing doing all these other things, and I'm still not feeling okay. I'm still not feeling satisfied. And Doyle's response to him was basically, you'll be satisfied in God eventually. That's how we'll get there. And so I think that is part of the programming for sure. But I can't judge if he had a real experience or not. I know I've certainly had experiences like that. And now when I look back at them, since I'm not entangled in Christianity anymore, I wonder how much of that was me just really needing to feel connected to a being that was higher than myself in order to be able to feel like there was hope to get through what I was going through. There was a purpose to get through it. And I don't know how much of that was self-manufactured and how much of that was emotion, but those experiences would definitely happen. And now I tend to think that they were a function of my psyche trying to comfort me, which I desperately needed in those moments.
Yeah, again, we have to only, I guess, go by what he said. When you were talking, I thought, this is what I'm going to say, and I have no idea what that was. I went to a program the other night, and there was a woman who worked in gerontology at VCU, and she said, instead of saying, I just had a senior moment, go, I just had a senior moment. I've lived so long that I can now have senior moments. So that's what I just did. I'm agreeing with what she said. I think and then I was going to say, this is how I look at it. And I don't know whether it's right or not, but this is how I look at it. I think there are a lot of opportunities that God puts out there for us. And so the other people that make the good things come about, I think, are God sent. So when you say that God's going to be your husband and your daughter and your spouse, I think God puts folks and things here to fill in those blanks. Because that's a lot of responsibility on God to be all those things. Right. It's a lot of responsibility when you've got a spouse and they're your everything. They're going to solve, they're going to do it all. Nobody can do it all. Right. And it's unfair to the relationship to look at that spouse to be your beginning and end of everything. This is just my thought. So I think that people are sent. But our eyes have to be open to that. We've got to be willing to see it.
So I would take an entirely materialistic view on that, not surprisingly. We've had Andy Thompson speak before. He talks about why we believe in gods, and it goes through our evolutionary things that have made up our brain and why we are agency detecting machines. So if we hear a rustle outside, we think, hey, is there a tiger? Is there something doing that? Instead of, oh, it was just the leaves. By the same token, if you listen to a record playing backwards, which was 20 years ago was a craze, you might not hear anything substantial. If somebody tells you it says, murder the boy, then you can pick out those tunes, and the next time you listen to it, you absolutely do hear it. It completely registers in your brain. It's not like the person is making up that they're sensing it, but it doesn't mean that's the message that was originally encoded. So I don't doubt that some people genuinely and deeply feel and believe this is God talking to me, but that has nothing to do with whether or not there's some anthropomorphic figure up in the clouds that's actually sending them a message. So that would be my take. Do you have anything else? Any last thoughts that either of you would like to leave us with?
I just want to say thank you to you and thank you to all of you. Rally the troops, educate.
I would say the same thing. I mean, I think just, if all of the people in here were able to start to educate those around them that this is a reality that's happening to our youth and to our young adults, and educate yourself on, there's plenty of material out there now. We've just scratched the surface. Educate yourself on how they are so deceptive, right, and how they're able to get away with that. Raising awareness is the way to go for this one. And then, we're always looking, I know APV, whenever we bring the legislation in front of the GA, we're always looking for medical professionals who are willing to testify against it. So, we put out a call for that kind of a thing, and rally the troops. That's exactly right. These kids are precious, and they need to be taught the message that they're okay. And that who they are is okay. It's life-changing to finally get that message. I didn't get it until I was well in my 20s. And I'm so thankful that I got it when I did. But, these kids are precious. They really need that message earlier.
You think, what can I do? Tomorrow, everybody in this room can say to somebody, you know what I did yesterday afternoon? Because I guarantee you the person you're talking to has never had a conversation about this before.
Yep, that's a great thing.
All right.
And thank you so much for doing
Yeah, no,
this and
thank you
putting
guys for
this
coming.
together.
Thank Bill and Bill. Thank you.